Zexthrak's crystalline exoskeleton clicked against the metal floor as he followed Lieutenant Rodriguez through the mining facility. His research team trailed behind, their data slates ready to record every perceived human weakness. "Your kind shouldn't even be able to walk in this gravity," he muttered, watching the humans move with surprising ease. "Your calcium-based skeletal structure is—" A loud crash cut him off. Emergency lights flashed red. "Cave in at Tunnel 6!" someone yelled through the comm system. Rodriguez sprinted toward the commotion, leaving Zexthrak struggling to keep up. When they reached the tunnel entrance, Sergeant Williams was already there, directing a group of miners. "Joe's trapped under the support beam," Williams shouted. "Ready?" 1, 2, dash. 5 miners positioned themselves around the fallen beam, their knees bent at angles that made Zexthrak wince. According to his studies, such positions should have snapped their joints. "Your joints are too fragile," he called out. "You'll break yourselves." Rodriguez shot him a look. "Our adaptability is our strength. Watch and learn." The miners shifted their weight, using the tunnel wall as leverage. They moved like water, flowing around the obstacles, their bodies working together in perfect sync. With a coordinated heave, they lifted the beam just enough for Joe to crawl free. Zexthrak's mandibles twitched in disbelief. His third eye blinked rapidly as he reviewed everything he thought he knew about human physiology. "How?" He started, then stopped. These fragile beings had just proved every assumption in his research wrong. If they could do this in heavy gravity, what else were they capable of? For the first time, he wondered if classifying humans as a protected species had been a terrible mistake. As the dust settled and Joe was pulled to safety, Zexthrak stood frozen in thought, his crystalline facets reflecting the shifting emergency lights. He had just witnessed something that defied every scientific assumption he held about human physiology. Before he could question it further, Rodriguez clapped him on the shoulder. "Still think we're fragile?" She smirked, leading him back toward the base. He had a lot to reconsider. "That was unexpected," Zexthrak admitted, watching the miners dust themselves off. His crystalline fingers tapped rapidly on his data slate, the sound like tiny chimes against the surface. "How did you manage that lift without breaking your limbs? The stress ratios alone should have caused multiple fractures." Joe, the rescued miner, grinned despite his scrapes and the dirt smeared across his face. "It's all about working with the gravity, not fighting it. See?" He demonstrated a slight crouch, his movements smooth despite the crushing pressure. "Lower your center, spread your feet wider than normal, like a tripod, sort of." Rodriguez nodded, her own stance shifting unconsciously to match. "Anya, let's show him the pivot drill, the one we developed for the heavy mining zones." Sergeant Williams stepped forward, dropping smoothly to one knee with practiced ease. "Watch carefully," she said, her voice steady despite the strain. In one fluid motion, she twisted her body and rose, ending in a perfect standing position. Sweat beaded on her forehead, but her smile never wavered. Zexthrak's facets flickered with interest, reflecting tiny rainbows across the chamber walls. "Impossible. Your knee joint shouldn't bend that way under this gravity. The torque alone." "But it does," Rodriguez said firmly, crossing her arms. "We're not as brittle as you think. Anya, show him again, slower this time. Let him see how the muscles compensate." Williams repeated the movement. Zexthrak recorded every angle, every shift of weight, his crystalline form leaning forward with obvious fascination. "Our bodies learn," one of the miners added, wiping grime from his hands onto his already filthy coveralls. "First week here was rough, but we adapted. Changed how we walk, how we lift, found new ways to move." "Adaptation implies imperfection," Zexthrak stated, his tone carrying that familiar Rigidian superiority. "A perfect form wouldn't need to." "With all due respect," Rodriguez cut in, her voice sharp as steel, "we don't appreciate being dismissed. Our ability to adapt is exactly what makes us valuable allies. Not everyone needs to be made of crystal to be strong." Zexthrak's crystalline form stiffened, light refracting through him in agitated patterns. The Concordate's protective status exists for good reason. Our research clearly shows. A high-pitched tone interrupted him. His communication crystal pulsed with urgent red light, casting bloody shadows across the chamber. The message that followed made his rigid posture go even straighter. "High Analyst," a voice crackled, thick with static and fear. "Return to base immediately. Border Outpost 7 has been destroyed. Complete devastation. Unknown hostile force. The Science Council requires your presence." ZX Thrak looked at Rodriguez, then at his data slate full of observations about human adaptability. For the first time in his career, he felt uncertainty crack his perfect Rigidian certainty like a hairline fracture in glass. "I must go," he said simply, turning toward the exit. His footsteps echoed differently now, heavier with the weight of new possibilities. The emergency transmission echoed in ZX Thrak's mind as he boarded the shuttle. The rigid certainty of Rigidian security had been shattered, replaced by an unfamiliar unease. As the ship lifted off, he glanced at Rodriguez, who sat calmly checking her sidearm. Humans always prepared for the unexpected. Perhaps it was time he learned to do the same. The Concordate shuttle hummed softly as it cut through space, its engines barely audible through the reinforced hull. Inside, ZX Thrak's crystalline form caught the starlight streaming through the viewport, sending tiny rainbows dancing across the cabin walls and ceiling in mesmerizing patterns. "Another outpost gone," he muttered, reviewing the reports on his data screen. "This makes no sense. Our defenses are flawless. Each barrier, every checkpoint, all designed with perfect symmetry." Lieutenant Rodriguez leaned forward in her seat, her face tight with concern, one hand absently touching the worn grip of her sidearm. "What exactly happened at the border? We need details if we're going to help." "The reports are disturbing." ZX Thrak's normally steady voice wavered, his crystalline surface dimming slightly. "The attackers somehow bypassed every security measure. Guards reported seeing their own colleagues walking the halls, even sharing meals with them, only to discover the real ones locked in storage units, some unconscious for days." "Shapeshifters?" Rodriguez frowned, running a hand through her short hair. "Like those old Earth movies? You know, the ones where aliens take over human bodies?" "We Rigidians don't deal in fiction," ZX Thrak said stiffly, his joints creaking as he turned. "Our defense systems are based on perfect geometric patterns. No one should be able to—" "That's exactly the problem," Rodriguez cut in, tapping her fingers on the armrest. "Perfect patterns are predictable. If these creatures can change their shape, they'll find the gaps in any fixed system. It's like trying to use the same password everywhere. Sooner or later, someone cracks it." ZX Thrak's crystalline surface flickered with indignation, casting sharp shadows across the cabin. "Are you suggesting our defensive designs are flawed? Generations of Rigidian engineers?" "I'm suggesting that sometimes being perfectly rigid isn't the answer." Rodriguez gestured to the stars outside, their light twinkling through the viewport. "Look, in combat training, we teach that the best defense is being unpredictable. Changing your tactics, adapting. Even the best boxer loses if they use the same moves every time." "Like your miners," ZX Thrak said slowly, his tone thoughtful. "Always shifting, adjusting, never quite following the same path twice." "Exactly. But the Concordate keeps treating us like we're helpless children who need protection. Maybe it's time to—" A light flashed on the console, cutting her off with its urgent beeping. The capital city of the Rigidian Empire came into view, a vast expanse of geometric crystal structures that caught and amplified the light of the system's twin suns, creating a dazzling display of refracted light that made Rodriguez squint. On the landing platform below, a group of delegates waited in perfect formation. At their center stood the imposing figure of Chieftain Kolrax, leader of the Monolith faction, his obsidian form casting a long shadow across the crystal surface. His edges seemed sharper than usual, his posture more rigid. "They look worried," Rodriguez noted as the shuttle began its descent. its landing lights reflecting off the crystalline surface below. "The Concordat doesn't worry," Zixthrak replied automatically, but his voice lacked its usual certainty. His own reflection in the viewport showed subtle cracks in his usually perfect composure. The shuttle touched down with a soft hiss of landing gear, and Rodriguez could see the assembled delegates shifting anxiously, their crystalline forms catching the light in sharp, nervous patterns. The usual perfect stillness of Rigidian ceremony was broken by small, telling movements, the equivalent of human fidgeting. The Rigidian capital came into view, its geometric skyline a stark contrast to the chaotic destruction in the border reports. As the shuttle descended, Zixthrak couldn't shake Rodriguez's words. Perfect patterns are predictable. He had always believed the Concordat's strength lay in its order, but if their enemies had learned to exploit it, could a different approach be the key to survival? The crystalline dome of the Rigidian Science Council sparkled overhead, sending shards of rainbow light dancing across the polished floor. Towering spires of pure crystal stretched up into the violet sky, their perfect angles catching and splitting the sunlight. The council members sat in perfect geometric formation, their rigid forms a stark contrast to Lieutenant Rodriguez's fluid stance. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, a motion that made several council members twitch with discomfort. Chieftain Colrax's deep voice echoed through the chamber. 3 outposts destroyed, hundreds missing. This is unprecedented. His crystalline fingers tapped against the podium, creating sharp, clicking sounds that bounced off the walls. "The morphoids slip through our defenses like water through fingers," another counselor added, their crystal form trembling with anger. "They become us, wear our faces. Just yesterday a guard killed his own brother, only to discover it wasn't his brother at all." Rodriguez stepped forward, her boots clicking against the floor. "If I may speak?" She didn't wait for permission. "Your current tactics won't work against an enemy that changes shape. You need something different, something unpredictable." Her hand rested casually on her hip near her sidearm, a gesture that made several council members lean back. Scoffs rippled through the council. "And what would humans know of advanced tactical warfare?" One member sneered. "Your species barely left its gravity well a century ago." "We know about adapting," Rodriguez said firmly, "about changing plans mid-fight, about using our opponent's strength against them. When you can't outgun them, you outsmart them." Zixthrak found himself nodding. "Council members, I've witnessed human adaptability firsthand. In the mines they—" "The mines?" A counselor interrupted, their voice sharp as breaking glass. "We're discussing military strategy, not manual labor. What could dirt-covered workers possibly teach us about warfare?" "Yet both require quick thinking and flexibility," Zixthrak countered, surprising himself. "Our perfect formations have failed against these morphoids. Perhaps imperfection is exactly what we need." The words felt strange coming from his mouth, almost heretical. Colrax leaned forward, his obsidian form catching the light. "What exactly are you proposing?" "A small team," Rodriguez explained. "Mobile, adaptive. We go in, gather intel, find their weakness. No rigid patterns for them to exploit. Hit them where they least expect it." "This is absurd," a counselor stood up. "Sending primitives to—" "Our traditional methods have failed," Colrax cut in, "and failure is not an option." He turned to Zixthrak. "You've studied the humans. You'll lead this mission with Lieutenant Rodriguez. Investigate the colony at the edge of our space, find out how these morphoids operate." Zixthrak straightened his crystalline form. "Yes, chieftain." "A human and a Rigidian," Rodriguez mused, a small smile playing at her lips. "Could be just crazy enough to work. Like mixing oil and water. Shouldn't work, but shake it up enough." The council's reluctant approval of Rodriguez's plan weighed heavily on Zixthrak's mind as their research vessel launched toward the devastated colony. For the first time, the Concordat was placing trust in human unpredictability. As the ship glided through the stars, he watched Rodriguez and her team run last-minute checks, their movements fluid and instinctive. Would their flexibility prove to be the advantage they needed? The Concordate research vessel hummed softly as it cut through the darkness of space, its engines working at peak efficiency despite the tension aboard. Lieutenant Rodriguez stood at the viewport, watching distant stars blur past, her fingers drumming absently on the reinforced glass. Behind her, Sergeant Williams helped the Rigidian scientists calibrate their scanning equipment, occasionally muttering under her breath when the alien tech didn't quite match human protocols. Zexthrak's crystalline form caught the starlight as he approached Rodriguez, rainbow patterns dancing across the deck. "The colony's last transmission came through an hour ago," he said, his usually confident voice tinged with unease. His rigid limbs seemed stiffer than usual, betraying his concern. Williams looked up from her work, wiping sweat from her brow. "Let's hear it." The ship's speakers crackled to life with a harsh burst of static that made everyone wince. At first, there was only white noise. Then a panicked voice broke through. "They're everywhere. They look like—" The message dissolved into screaming before cutting off completely, leaving behind an eerie silence that seemed to fill the bridge. "How do you handle it?" Zexthrak asked Williams quietly, his crystalline features catching the dim light. "The fear of the unknown?" Williams set down her tools with a clank and faced him, her round face serious but kind. "We lean on each other, share our fears, support each other. It's not weakness, it's what makes us stronger, like a chain, you know?" "Interesting." Zexthrak's facets reflected thoughtfully, creating small rainbows on the walls. "The Rigidian way teaches us to stand alone, unmoved, like the crystals we resemble." Rodriguez joined them, her face grim, boots clicking against the metal floor. "Maybe that's why the colony fell. They were left to face this alone, weren't they?" Zexthrak's crystalline form stiffened with an audible crack. "The Concordate, we never expected such an attack. The colony's defenses were minimal. We thought—" "Standard procedure?" Rodriguez's voice held an edge sharp enough to cut. "We believed our presence alone would deter any threats," Zexthrak admitted, his voice hollow. "The Concordate's reputation—" "Reputation doesn't stop bullets," Williams cut in gently, patting his crystal arm. "Or whatever these morphoids use." The ship's alert system pulsed, bathing them in red light that reflected off Zexthrak's form like a disco ball. They'd arrived. Through the viewport they could see the colony below, a sight that made Williams gasp. What had once been gleaming crystal spires now lay in ruins, like shattered glass in a broken mirror. The surface was scorched black, still smoking in places with occasional sparks dancing through the destruction. Plasma discharge hung in the air like an evil fog, giving everything a sickly green tinge. "No life signs," one of the Rigidian scientists reported, their voice flat and emotionless. "All readings negative." The landing gear engaged with a soft thud that echoed through the ship. As the airlock cycled, Rodriguez checked her weapon, running through the safety protocols with practiced ease. Williams prepped her medical kit, though her face suggested she doubted she'd need it, her usual smile nowhere to be seen. The outer door opened with a hiss. Hot, acrid air rushed in, carrying the smell of burned metal and something else, something alien. They stepped onto the burned ground, their boots crunching on crystalline debris that sparkled despite the destruction. All around them silence reigned like a heavy blanket. No survivors in sight. Just destruction, as far as the eye could see, stretching to the dark horizon. The desolation of the colony left an eerie silence in the research vessel's command center. Every scan confirmed the same grim reality. No survivors on the surface. But just as doubt crept in, a faint emergency beacon pulsed on their sensors. Zexthrak leaned forward, his crystalline fingers tightening. If there were survivors below, they might hold the key to understanding the enemy and saving what remained of the Concordate. The scorched ground crunched under Rodriguez's boots as she swept her scanner across the colony's main plaza. Broken crystal structures jutted from the ground like shattered teeth, their once gleaming surfaces now dull and lifeless. Beside her, ZX moved with unusual hesitation, his normally confident stride replaced by careful steps that seemed to test each piece of ground before committing. "Look at this," Williams called out, kneeling next to what remained of a security barrier. The metal was warped in strange patterns, as if it had melted and reformed multiple times. Dark streaks ran through it like veins in marble. "I've never seen damage like this before." Zixthrak's scanner hummed as he analyzed the distorted metal, the device's soft blue light casting eerie shadows. These readings, impossible. The molecular structure shows signs of biological manipulation. Whatever did this could change its own cellular makeup to match and absorb materials. It's like nothing in our records. Rodriguez traced her hand along a nearby wall, feeling the odd texture beneath her fingers. They didn't just break in, they became part of the defenses. She pointed to several guard posts, their gun emplacements torn apart from the inside out. "See how the attack patterns make no sense? They were hit from positions that should have been secure. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere." "Our perfect defense." ZX voice carried an unfamiliar bitterness, his crystalline form seeming to dim. "All our carefully designed systems, our unbreakable protocols." He touched one of the transformed barriers, his rigid fingers scraping against the warped surface. "Useless against an enemy that could simply become us." William studied her tablet, frowning at the streams of data. The defensive AI logs show everything working normally right until the end. No alarms, no alerts. The system thought the attackers belonged here. They fooled our best tech like it was child's play. As they moved deeper into the colony, they found more disturbing evidence. Concordant communication arrays had been partially absorbed, their crystalline components twisted into alien configurations that somehow still hummed with power. Security doors stood open, their locking mechanisms seamlessly merged with surrounding frames, creating grotesque sculptures of metal and crystal. "All our rigid structures," Zixthrak said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Our unchanging patterns. We made it easy for them, didn't we? Our greatest strength became our biggest weakness." Before Rodriguez could respond, a faint ping caught their attention, cutting through the eerie silence. Williams adjusted her scanner, her eyes widening. "Getting something, weak signal, but definitely a concordant emergency beacon. Someone's still alive down there." They followed the signal to a heavy blast door, half hidden under debris and scorch marks. Unlike the other security systems they'd seen, this one showed signs of desperate, last-minute modifications. Wires stuck out at odd angles and makeshift patches covered key components. "Life signs," Williams announced, her scanner displaying multiple readings. "Faint, but they're down there. At least a dozen, maybe more." ZX studied the door's hastily rewired controls, running his fingers over the jury-rigged systems. They changed the protocols, abandoned standard concordant security measures. He looked at Rodriguez, something like hope flickering in his crystalline features. They adapted. Maybe we can learn after all. The beacon's steady pulse echoed through their scanners, calling them deeper into the colony's underground levels, where survivors waited in the darkness below. The heavy blast door groaned open, revealing the dim bunker beyond. Zixthrak hesitated, his crystalline form reflecting the flickering emergency lights. The concordant rarely retreated, rarely hid. Yet here were survivors, adapting to the unthinkable. As they stepped inside, Rodriguez scanned the room and called out, "We're here to help." The silence that followed carried both hesitation and hope. The bunker door groaned as Rodriguez and Zixthrak forced it open. Stale air rushed out, carrying the sharp smell of fear and desperation. Dust particles swirled in the beam as Williams clicked on her shoulder light, its bright ray cutting through the darkness like a knife. "Hello?" Rodriguez called out, her voice steady and clear. "We're here to help. United Space Federation. Anyone down here?" Weak moans echoed from deeper inside, bouncing off the metal walls. As they moved forward, their lights revealed huddled shapes. Survivors crowded against the walls like frightened children. Many were wounded, their crystalline forms cracked or dulled, some barely glowing at all. "Medical supplies now," Williams said, already rushing to the nearest injured Rigidian. She pulled out her field kit and began working with practiced efficiency, her hands moving fast but gentle over the alien forms. A tall figure emerged from the shadows, his steps uneven but determined. Despite his damaged exterior with cracks running down his left side, he carried himself with authority. "I am Tal Mir, Security Commander," he said, his voice rough like grinding stones. "What's left of security, anyway?" "What happened here?" Zekthrak asked, his usual formal tone tinged with concern as he studied his injured kindred. Tal Mir's crystalline surface flickered dimly like a dying light bulb. "They looked like us. Moved like us. One moment I was giving orders to my lieutenant. The next..." He shuddered, a grinding sound coming from his joints. "It wasn't my lieutenant anymore. The thing wearing his form disabled our shields from within. We never stood a chance." Rodriguez watched as several survivors drew back when she approached, pressing themselves against the cold walls. One of them spoke up, voice bitter and sharp. "How can we trust these soft creatures? Their bodies are nothing but water and weakness. They'll break at the slightest touch." "Those soft creatures just saved your lives," Tal Mir responded sharply, his voice echoing in the confined space. "Our perfect systems failed us. Our rigid protocols were turned against us. Look where our superiority got us." Zekthrak moved among the survivors, recording their conditions with his built-in scanners. His movements were uncertain, almost hesitant, so different from his usual confident stride. Every few steps he would pause as if lost in thought. "The Concordat. We were not prepared for this kind of threat. All our planning, all our certainty." "They're gone now," Tal Mir said quietly, his glow dimming further. "But they'll be back. They always come back, like waves against a shore." Williams looked up from treating a wounded Rigidian, wiping sweat from her forehead with her sleeve. "We need to get these people to proper medical facilities. Some of these injuries are beyond my field equipment. They need specialized care." Rodriguez nodded, then turned to address the group, her voice firm but kind. "We have a ship waiting topside. We can evacuate everyone, but we need to move quickly. Time isn't on our side." "And go where?" one of the survivors asked, their voice cracking. "No place is safe now. They'll find us wherever we run." "Maybe that's because you've been too focused on building perfect defenses," Rodriguez said firmly, crossing her arms. "Instead of learning to adapt, sometimes the strongest wall is the one that can bend without breaking." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken fear and desperate hope. Even those who had shown distrust began to rise, their crystalline forms catching the light as they moved. They had no choice. Their world of certainty had crumbled, leaving only questions in the helping hands of those they'd once dismissed. The sound of creaking joints and scraping crystal filled the bunker as the survivors prepared to leave their shattered sanctuary behind. With the survivors evacuated, the research vessel set course for the capital. In the medbay, Zekthrak watched Williams patch up cracked exoskeletons with a precision that rivaled Rigidian healers. The surviving guard still eyed the humans warily, but Tal Mir spoke first. "We need to rethink our defenses," he admitted. "Rigid formations won't work anymore." For the first time, Zekthrak saw the weight of tradition begin to crack. "Form 2 lines," Rodriguez directed, her voice steady and clear in the dim bunker. "Walking wounded on the left, critical cases on the right. Anyone who can help others, please do so carefully." Williams moved among the injured Concordat members, her hands quick but gentle as she applied emergency patches to their crystalline forms. A young Rigidian scientist flinched as she touched his cracked arm, his crystalline surface dulled with stress fractures. "Easy there," Williams said softly, adjusting her grip to better support the damaged limb. "I know our methods seem strange, but trust me, I've treated worse breaks than this, even on your kind. Zekthrak watched, fascinated as the humans wove between the survivors with unpredictable movements. Each step seemed different from the last, their joints bending at varying angles, their spines twisted and turned in ways that made his rigid frame ache just watching. Near a collapsed section of the bunker, where fallen beams created dangerous shadows, Rodriguez spotted something unusual. "Hi, analyst, look at this. You'll want to see this yourself." Zekthrak approached, his crystalline form catching the light and sending rainbow patterns across the walls. On the ground lay a quivering mass of tissue, its surface rippling like mercury, but never settling into a stable shape. It pulsed weakly in the emergency lights. "Morphoid remnant," Talmir explained, limping over with a noticeable crack in his left leg. "We found that they couldn't maintain their forms after death, but while alive..." He shuddered, the movement sending tiny crystalline sounds through the air. "They copied our formations perfectly. Every defensive pattern we used, they learned and countered. It was like fighting our own reflections." Zekthrak carefully collected samples, noting how the tissue struggled to mimic the rigid angles of nearby debris. But when Williams reached for a medical scanner, moving with her typical fluid grace, the tissue barely reacted to her fluid movement. It seemed to give up trying to copy her entirely. "Fascinating," Zekthrak muttered, making rapid notes in his data pad. "The tissue shows minimal response to human motion patterns. It's as if your unpredictability confuses it. The randomness of your movements appears to prevent replication." "That tracks," Rodriguez said, helping another survivor toward the exit. She adjusted her stance with each step, never moving quite the same way twice. "They beat your formations because they're predictable. Same angles, same responses every time. But humans? We're messy. No two of us move exactly alike." As they loaded the last survivors onto the research vessel, Zekthrak ran detailed scans of the morphoid samples. The results confirmed his growing suspicion. The tissue could perfectly replicate rigid, geometric forms, but struggled with anything requiring multiple joint articulation or random movement patterns. The implications made his crystal structure vibrate with excitement. "Lieutenant Rodriguez," Zekthrak called out, his tone carrying an unfamiliar note of respect. "I believe I owe you an apology. What I once considered a design flaw in human physiology may actually be your greatest defense against these creatures. Your imperfection might be exactly what we need." The data from the morphoid remains was unlike anything in the Concordat archives. Zekthrak's fingers moved quickly across the analysis panel, his mind racing. The creatures had mimicked everything, except human motion. Rodriguez and her team moved too unpredictably, too fluidly. As they prepared their report for High Command, he realized that this wasn't just a tactical insight. It was a revelation. The research vessel hummed quietly through space as Zekthrak's crystalline fingers moved across the data screen. The soft blue glow reflected off his angular form as he reviewed footage from their recent mission. He paused, looking at Rodriguez, who sat across from him in the ship's small briefing room, her uniform still dusty from the rescue operation. "Your people moved like water during the rescue," he said. "I've never seen anything like it. The way you flowed through those tight spaces, adapted to each new threat." Rodriguez nodded, her eyes tired but alert. She absently rubbed a bruise on her forearm. "That's because we don't follow fixed patterns. Every human moves differently. It's what makes us hard to predict. We react based on instinct and training, not pre-programmed responses." "Precisely." Zekthrak's facets caught the light as he added another note to his report. His usually rigid posture seemed somehow softer today. "The morphoids struggled most when facing unpredictable movements. Your imperfections might be our greatest advantage. We've been blind to this possibility for too long." Down the corridor, Williams helped another survivor sit up in the medical bay, her gentle hand steadying the crystalline form. Talmir watched from his bed, his crystalline form still bearing deep cracks from the attack. The medical equipment beeped steadily in the background. "I don't understand," Talmir said quietly, his voice crackling with strain. "Your species is so soft. Yet you carried 3 of my people to safety without hesitation, through fire and darkness." "Being soft doesn't make us weak," Williams replied, adjusting a healing patch with practiced care. "It means we can bend without breaking. That's how we've survived everything space has thrown at us." In the ship's command center, a transmission from Chieftain Colrax blazed across the main screen. Her massive form dominated the view, crystalline features sharp with anger. The crew stood at attention as she spoke. "Unacceptable," her voice boomed, making the speakers crackle. "The Concordate's finest outpost, infiltrated so easily. These morphoids mock everything we stand for." She paused, her next words clearly difficult, her crystal form seeming to dim slightly. Perhaps we have been too rigid in our thinking. Lieutenant Rodriguez, your team's actions cannot be ignored. I am calling an emergency session with your Federation leaders. We must adapt or we will shatter." Zexthrak finished his report with a final recommendation, his fingers moving with newfound purpose. "Full tactical integration with human forces is not just advised, it is essential for our survival. Their adaptive nature represents our best defense against morphoid infiltration. The time for change is now." The research vessel's engines pushed on through the darkness, carrying its cargo of survivors, shattered pride, and the seeds of change. Among the stars, old traditions began to crack, making way for something new and stronger. The War Council chamber was silent as Zexthrak and Rodriguez took their places. The findings from the colony had shaken the Concordate's foundation, and now, the High Command awaited answers. As Zexthrak stepped forward, he took one last look at the footage of the humans in battle, twisting, adapting, overcoming. It was time to challenge everything the Concordate thought it knew. The crystalline dome of High Command stretched above them like frozen waves. Thousands of delegates from across the Concordate filled the chamber, their forms ranging from living crystal to metallic constructs. At the center podium, Zexthrak stood beside Rodriguez, his normally steady voice wavering slightly. "Honorable delegates," he began, "what we witnessed on the colony cannot be ignored. The morphoids exploited our greatest strength, our predictability, and turned it into our greatest weakness." Murmurs rippled through the assembly. Colrax, towering over the other council members, raised a gleaming hand for silence. Rodriguez stepped forward, activating a holoprojector. "Watch carefully," she said. The projection showed humans working in various gravity conditions, miners pivoting through tight spaces, soldiers adapting their stance mid-fight, medics contorting to reach wounded comrades. "Each movement is unique," Zexthrak explained. "No fixed patterns, no predictable responses. This is why the morphoids struggled to copy humans effectively." "Preposterous," a delegate's voice rang out. "You suggest we abandon our perfect forms for chaos?" "Not chaos," Rodriguez replied calmly. "Adaptability." Colrax leaned forward. "The evidence is compelling, but this goes against centuries of Concordate doctrine. Humans were meant to be protected, not consulted." With respect, Zexthrak's crystalline form caught the light as he turned to address the full assembly. "Our doctrine never faced an enemy like the morphoids. What we once saw as flaws in human design, their multiple joints, their varying movements, these are exactly what we need." The chamber erupted in debate. Some delegates pointed angrily at the humans, while others studied the hollow projections with growing interest. "Order!" Colrax's voice boomed. "We will put it to a vote. The motion, to grant humans temporary advisory status in military matters concerning the morphoid threat." The tension was thick as the votes were cast. When the final tally appeared, Rodriguez held her breath. The motion had passed? Barely. "Let it be recorded," Colrax announced, "that on this day, the Concordate acknowledges humanity as military advisors. May we not regret this break from tradition." The vote had passed barely, but it was enough. Humanity was no longer just a protected species. They were now tactical advisors. As the decision rippled through the Concordat, ZX Thrak returned to his research station. He watched Rodriguez drill her soldiers in unpredictable, ever-shifting maneuvers. For the first time in his life, he wondered if adaptability was a greater strength than rigidity. Commander Park stepped off the transport, his boots clicking against the crystalline platform. The capital world's 3 suns cast dancing shadows through the translucent buildings. Rodriguez met him with a crisp salute. "Welcome to the Concordat capital, sir," she said. "At ease, Lieutenant. Quite a sight." Park's measured gaze took in the towering spires. "Where is our welcoming committee?" As if on cue, Colrax approached with Talmir and several other Concordat officials. Their rigid forms created stark contrasts against the flowing architecture. "Commander Park," Colrax's voice resonated, "we have prepared the training grounds as requested." In the vast chamber designated for drills, human soldiers demonstrated their adaptive combat techniques. They switched from standard gravity to 0G in seconds, their movements fluid and unpredictable. Some bounced off walls while others rolled and twisted, firing training weapons from impossible angles. "Fascinating," muttered a young Rigidian scientist, furiously taking notes. "The joint rotation alone defies our current models." Talmir watched with arms crossed. "It's chaotic." "That's the point," Park explained. "The morphoids excel at copying patterns. We don't give them any." A group of Rigidian scientists huddled around ZX Thrak, pointing at diagrams of flexible joint designs. "Could we incorporate this into our exosuits?" one asked eagerly. "Perhaps a modified crystal matrix?" "The potential is worth exploring," ZX Thrak replied, his own rigid form seeming less imposing than before. The survivors from the colony attack gathered at the observation deck. Rodriguez noticed their expressions changing from doubt to hope as they watched humans and Concordat members training together. "Ready to run the test engagement simulation?" Park asked Colrax. "Yes," she replied. "Though I must admit, your methods still unsettle me." "Good," Park smiled. "That means they'll unsettle the morphoids too." The planning room buzzed with activity as both species worked to merge their strengths. Concordat precision weaponry with human unpredictability. Maps and tactical displays filled the air as they prepared for their first real test against the enemy. The research vessel thrummed with tension as it approached the morphoid-controlled zone. This was no longer theory. Now, it was war. Zexthrak stood at the command console, watching as human pilots adjusted their formations on the fly. The Concordat fleet was used to precision, but today they would fight like their human allies, unpredictably. The Joint Task Force's ship sliced through the darkness of space, its crystalline hull gleaming. Inside the command center, Lieutenant Rodriguez stood beside Zexthrak, watching the sensor displays. "Multiple contacts," a Rigidian officer announced. "Morphoid scout vessels approaching." Rodriguez tapped her comm. "All teams rotate positions. Williams, take your squad to Junction B." "Copy that," Williams' voice crackled. "Moving now." Zexthrak observed the humans' seemingly chaotic movements with fascination. Every hour, sometimes every few minutes, they switched posts and changed security codes. No pattern, no predictability. "They're attempting to dock," the sensor officer reported. 3 contact points. "Just like we planned," Rodriguez said, nodding to her team. "Spread out. Keep moving. Don't let them lock onto any single formation." The first sign of morphoid infiltration came at the lower hull. A shape, almost perfect but not quite human, emerged from a shadow. Williams' squad was ready. They rolled, ducked, and weaved through the corridor, their movements fluid and unpredictable. The morphoid struggled to match their patterns. "They can't copy us fast enough," Williams shouted over the comm. Her team struck from multiple angles, their combat style a mix of kicks, punches, and grapples that left the shapeshifter unable to adapt. More morphoids breached other sections, but each time they met the same challenge: humans fighting with constantly changing tactics. Rodriguez's team defended the command center using quick, darting movements that the Morphoids couldn't anticipate. "Remarkable," HFY muttered, recording everything. "Their joint flexibility. It's too complex for the Morphoids to replicate quickly enough." The battle reached its peak when 3 Morphoids tried to rush the bridge. Rodriguez's squad met them head-on, but not with the rigid formations the Concordat usually employed. Instead, they rolled under attacks, sprang up from unexpected angles, and struck with varying force and speed. The Morphoids, for the first time anyone could remember, began to retreat. Their usual perfect mimicry failed against the humans' constant variations. One by one, they withdrew to their ships. "They're pulling back," the sensor officer announced, surprise evident in his crystalline voice. HFY's facets flickered with excitement as he watched the Morphoid vessels disappear into deep space. "The first successful defense against a Morphoid infiltration," he said, "all because of human unpredictability." Rodriguez wiped sweat from her forehead. Sometimes being imperfect has its advantages. The command center erupted in celebrations, humans hugging, Rigidians clicking their crystalline forms together in their version of approval. They had done it. They had proved that flexibility could defeat infiltration. The Morphoids had retreated, a victory, but a temporary one. In the mess hall, humans and Rigidians shared stories, their laughter blending in an uneasy harmony. HFY sat beside Rodriguez, watching as surviving Concordat officers hesitantly imitated the fluid combat movements humans had demonstrated. Change was happening, whether the Concordat was ready for it or not. The task force's victory celebration filled the ship's mess hall with an unusual mix of sounds: human laughter and the crystalline chiming of pleased Rigidians. Commander Park stood at the front, his usually stern face softened with pride. "Today, we proved that adaptation is stronger than infiltration," Park announced, his voice carrying across the room. "Every member of this joint force contributed to this success." Chieftain Colrax moved forward, her crystalline form catching the light. She paused, as if carefully choosing her words. "The flexibility of your tactics proved effective," she admitted. "Though it goes against our traditional approach, we cannot deny the results." In a corner of the hall, several Concordat officials huddled together, their faces troubled. "But at what cost?" one whispered. "Our perfect formations, our precise movements, these are the backbone of our society." "Change doesn't mean losing who we are," another argued back. "It means growing stronger." Sergeant Williams sat with a group of monolith survivors, sharing stories over their victory meal. She noticed one of them, still bandaged from the colony attack, flinching at loud noises. "Here," Williams said softly, offering a warm drink. "This helps me when I'm feeling shaky after a fight." The monolith survivor accepted the drink with trembling hands. "You fought for us today," they said, "like you fought to save us at the colony. Perhaps we were wrong about humans being inferior." William smiled. "Different doesn't mean better or worse. It just means different." The celebration was cut short by a blaring alarm. Commander Park rushed to the command center, followed by Rodriguez and HFY. The sensor displays lit up with multiple incoming signals. A Concordat communication officer's voice shook as they reported, "Multiple Morphoid fleet signatures detected. They're advancing on 6 Concordat worlds simultaneously." The room fell silent. The brief moment of victory evaporated as the true scale of their challenge became clear. "Show me," Colrax demanded, her crystalline form rigid with tension. The tactical display revealed waves of Morphoid ships approaching major Concordat populations. This wasn't a scouting party anymore. This was an invasion. The celebrations were short-lived. The War Council chamber filled once more as sensor readings confirmed the worst. 6 Concordat worlds were now under attack. Zexthrak clenched his fists as the debate resumed. The Concordat wanted to respond with overwhelming force, but after what he had seen, he knew that rigid tactics would fail again. They needed a new way. The War Council chamber buzzed with nervous energy. Crystalline beings from across the Concordat filled the seats, their forms glinting under the harsh emergency lights. Commander Park stood at the center, facing the assembled delegates. Colrax's voice rang out across the chamber. "The Adamantite fleet stands ready," she announced. "Their capital ships are the strongest in our alliance." The Adamantite leader, a towering figure of pure diamond, nodded slowly. "Our ships are built on the principle of absolute structural integrity. No joints, no weak points." "That's exactly our problem," Zexthrak cut in, stepping forward with his datapad. "My latest analysis shows something remarkable. Humans can keep fighting even after taking hits that would shatter our troops." He displayed footage from their recent victory. "Look here. When Sergeant Williams took a glancing blow, she rolled with it. A Rigidian would have cracked." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Commander Park seized the moment. "We need to change our entire approach," he said, activating the tactical display. "Instead of one massive fleet formation, we split into smaller independent cells. Each cell adapts to local conditions, responds to threats in real time." "Madness," shouted one of the Concordat officials. "Our strength lies in unity, in perfect coordination." "Our strength," Park countered calmly, "lies in surviving this threat. The Morphoids expect rigid formations. They're counting on it." A delegate from the outer colonies stood up. "How do we know this isn't some human plot? They could be working with the Morphoids." Rodriguez stepped forward, her face tight with controlled anger. "We lost colonies to the Morphoids too. We're all fighting for survival here." Colrax raised her hand for silence. "The humans proved themselves in the last battle, but this plan, it goes against everything we've built." "Sometimes," Zexthrak said quietly, "we must bend to avoid breaking." After hours of heated debate, the Council reached its decision. Human special forces would lead strike teams, targeting Morphoid weak points, while Concordat capital ships provided heavy firepower support. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was something new. Something the Morphoids wouldn't expect. The shift in strategy was unlike anything the Concordat had attempted before. Rodriguez and Park led training drills alongside Rigidian commanders, their combined teams moving in fluid, unpredictable patterns. Watching from the sidelines, Zexthrak felt something new: pride. The Concordat was learning, and this time, they might just survive. The massive hangar bay of the Concordat flagship hummed with activity. Lieutenant Rodriguez watched as crystalline engineers made last-minute adjustments to the human infiltration pods. The sight was remarkable. Rigidian technicians working side by side with human mechanics, their differences forgotten in the rush of preparation. "It's strange to think this all started with a mind collapse," Zexthrak said, his crystalline form catching the light as he approached Rodriguez. She smiled. "You thought we were too fragile back then." "I was wrong about many things," Zexthrak admitted. "Your adaptability, what we once saw as weakness, may be our salvation." Through the viewport, hundreds of ships moved into position. The rigid, geometric formations of Concordat vessels were now interspersed with smaller human craft, creating unpredictable patterns that would confuse Morphoid targeting systems. Commander Park's voice crackled over the comm system. "Attention all forces." His calm tone carried across every ship in the fleet. "Look around you. Every species here brings something unique to this fight. The Concordat's strength, humanity's flexibility. Together we're stronger than apart." Rodriguez watched the crews snap to attention. Humans, Rigidians, Adamantites, all united. Park continued. "This is the largest fleet ever assembled in Concordat space. We face an enemy that thinks it can predict our every move. Let's show them how wrong they are." The sensor arrays lit up suddenly. A junior officer called out, "Multiple contacts detected in the asteroid belt." Morphoid signatures confirmed. Through the massive observation windows, Rodriguez could see the asteroid field ahead, a perfect hiding spot for an ambush. The Concordate's capital ships moved forward in their new flexible formations, their weapon systems charging. All human infiltration teams to pods, Park ordered. Prepare for deployment on my mark. Rodriguez gave Zexthrak a quick nod before heading to her assigned pod. Around her, other human soldiers did the same, their movements quick and fluid. Exactly the kind of unpredictability the Morphoids couldn't copy. The first wave of Concordate ships entered weapons range. Energy beams lanced out across space, lighting up the darkness between the asteroids. The battle for survival was about to begin. The battle was coming. As the fleet moved into position, the usual rigid formations of Concordate warships had changed. Smaller, shifting groups of vessels moved between the dreadnoughts, forcing the Morphoids to react instead of predict. Zexthrak exhaled, his crystalline chest vibrating slightly. If this gamble failed, the Concordate might never recover. But if it worked? The asteroid belt erupted in blinding flashes as Morphoid ships emerged from hiding. Their organic-looking vessels pulsed with an eerie light, spreading out to envelope the Concordate fleet in a deadly net. But this time, the Concordate wasn't playing by the old rules. "Break formation!" Commander Park's voice crackled through the comms. "Flexible cells, pattern Delta." The massive monolith dreadnought split apart like a blooming flower, each protected by darting human vessels. Rodriguez watched from her infiltration pod as the Morphoids hesitated, their usual tactic of targeting rigid formations suddenly useless. "They're trying to board the adamantite cruiser," Williams called out. "Section 3. Through the pod's viewport, Rodriguez saw shape-shifting forms attempting to latch onto a Concordate vessel. But the human escort ships were ready, their erratic movements and random patrol patterns making it impossible for the Morphoids to predict safe landing zones. Biomechanical analysis confirms they can't maintain stable forms during high-speed maneuvers. Zexthrak's voice came through clear and confident from the capital ship. Their molecular cohesion fails when forced to adapt to too many variables at once. Rodriguez smiled grimly as she led her infiltration pod toward the massive Morphoid flagship. Her team's suits had extra joints built in, a design that had made Zexthrak uncomfortable at first, but now proved invaluable. They twisted through debris and weapons fire with inhuman precision. Multiple infiltration attempts on decks 7 through 12, a Rigidian officer reported. But the rotating security protocols are working. They can't maintain disguises long enough to penetrate our defenses. The battle raged across the asteroid field. Monolith dreadnoughts unleashed devastating broadsides, while human ships danced between their firing arcs, keeping the Morphoids off balance and confused. "Target in range," Williams announced as their pods approached the Morphoid flagship, ready for breach maneuvers. Rodriguez watched her tactical display as the pods split into 3 groups, approaching the massive vessel from different vectors. The Morphoid ship's surface rippled and shifted, trying to form defensive barriers, but the humans' movements were too unpredictable to counter. "Now," Rodriguez commanded. Their pods fired magnetic grapples, latching onto the hull at precisely calculated points. Using their enhanced suit joints, the teams contorted through tight spaces and around shifting barriers. With a thunderous blast, they breached the outer airlock. Rodriguez led the charge inside, Williams and their teams right behind her. They stood in the organic-looking corridor of the Morphoid flagship, weapons ready. "We're in," Rodriguez reported back to the fleet, moving to locate the Overmind's command node. The infiltration team moved like ghosts through the Morphoid flagship, twisting and adapting to its shifting corridors. The grotesque walls pulsed as the ship tried to respond, but it couldn't adjust fast enough. Rodriguez gestured to her team. There was no turning back now. They had to reach the Overmind before it adapted. The walls oozed and pulsed around Rodriguez's team as they pushed deeper into the Morphoid flagship. Drips of biomass fell from the ceiling like thick, dark rain. The corridor ahead twisted and reshaping itself, trying to block their path. "Down!" Rodriguez called, dropping to her belly as a wall suddenly bulged outward. Her team followed instantly, sliding under the obstacle with practiced ease. "These passages keep shifting," Williams said, her eyes scanning the organic surfaces. "But look, there's a pattern to the tissue structure. See how it bunches before it moves?" Rodriguez nodded. "Good catch. Everyone watch those tissue clusters. They'll tell us where the next shift is coming from." They crawled through tight spaces, rolled under sudden barriers, and twisted around corners that hadn't existed seconds before. Their flexible movements seemed to confuse the living ship. It was designed to trap beings with rigid movements, not humans who could contort and adapt. "The node should be through here," Williams said, pointing to a pulsing chamber ahead. "These vessels all lead to it, like arteries to a heart." A figure stepped out of the shadows, Lieutenant Rodriguez herself, but Williams noticed something off about its stance. "That's not you," Williams said quietly. "Its weight distribution is wrong. Too perfect. Too stable." The real Rodriguez didn't hesitate. She fired 3 shots into the imposter, which dissolved into writhing biomass. "Plant the charges here," Williams directed, pointing to key spots where the tissue patterns converged. "The biological structure is weakest at these junction points." They worked quickly, setting their modular explosives. The walls thrashed more violently now, sensing their intent. A high-pitched keen filled the air, the overmind's screech of fury. "Charges set," Rodriguez called. "Move, move, move." They sprinted back through the twisting corridors as the first explosions rocked the ship. The overmind's shriek rose to an unbearable pitch. Behind them, chain reactions tore through the biological structure, each blast triggering the next. The flagship began breaking apart around them, its controlled shape-shifting degrading into chaos. Rodriguez's team pushed their bodies to the limit, bending and weaving through the collapsing passages, staying just ahead of the destruction. They could see their entry point ahead, the breached airlock where their escape pods waited. The Overmind's death cry echoed through the disintegrating ship as they made their final sprint to safety. The explosion shattered the Morphoid flagship, sending debris spiraling into the void. Rodriguez and her team barely made it back to the fleet before the blast wave hit. As they stepped onto the command deck, battered but alive, Zexthrak watched them with something he never thought he'd feel toward humans: admiration. The massive view screen on the Concordat flagship showed scattered debris where the Morphoid fleet had been. Broken ships drifted like fallen leaves in space. Through the wreckage, rescue vessels darted back and forth, their lights cutting through the darkness. "Status report," Colrax demanded, her crystalline form catching the starlight. "The Morphoids are in full retreat, Chieftain," a Rigidian officer reported. "Without their overmind, they've lost all coordination." In the medical bay, Williams moved between beds, checking on wounded from all species. She paused to adjust a monolith warrior's support brace, then helped a human marine with plasma burns. The sight would have been unthinkable just months ago. "Some are calling to hunt down the remaining Morphoids," Rodriguez said, standing beside Zexthrak on the bridge. "Finish them off completely." Zexthrak's crystalline features shifted in thought. Perhaps there's another way. Even they might learn to adapt, given time. 2 weeks later, the Grand Hall of the Rigidian Science Council buzzed with anticipation. Zexthrak stood at the podium, his final report complete. "Fellow council members," he began, his voice clear and strong. "I once believed perfection meant being unchanging, unbreakable. I was wrong. Our human allies have shown us that true perfection lies in adaptation. What we saw as flaws, their joints, their flexibility, their constant motion, these became our salvation. Their perceived weaknesses were actually strengths." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Colrax stepped forward, her voice carrying across the chamber. "The Concordat hereby recognizes humanity as full members of our alliance. The protected species designation is officially lifted." On the parade grounds outside, a group of human martial artists demonstrated their skills. Aliens of all species watched in amazement as the humans moved with fluid grace, spinning, leaping, and rolling in ways that had once seemed primitive. Now those same movements represented hope for a new future. If you enjoyed the story of Jonathan, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.